Why the Soviet Union wasn't real socialism. Hello, my name is Zinho, and in this video I'll be presenting two arguments for why the Soviet Union wasn't socialist. I'm not necessarily defending them nor defending the Soviet Union, just presenting the arguments so you can evaluate for yourself. You can see this video as an extension of my previous video in defense of socialism. If you haven't seen it, pause this one and go watch it, since it will be using the definitions laid out in that video. It's common to see the arguments that the Soviet Union isn't real socialism as a way to escape any criticism of this theoretical ideal. You can see this as a not true Scottishman fallacy, that is, an informal fallacy in which one attempts to protect their universal generalization from falsifying counterexample by excluding the counterexample improperly, according to Wikipedia. But are there any merits to those arguments? As we present in the previous video in defense of socialism, to a given society to count as socialist, there are conditions that such society must satisfy. So were those conditions satisfied on the Soviet Union? I will present a video of Noam Chomsky that explains far better than I can.
So the question is about the Soviet Union, and particularly about Lenin. So what was Leninism? Well, here we have to look at the facts. Now, you look at the facts, I think here's what you find. Lenin was a right-wing deviation of the socialist movement, and he was so regarded. He was regarded as that by the Marxists, by the mainstream Marxists. We've forgotten who the mainstream Marxists were because they lost, and you only remember the guys who won. But if you go back to that period, the mainstream Marxists were people like, for example, Anton Pannekoek, who was head of education for the Marxist movement, and he's one of the people who Lenin later denounced as an infantile leftist. But he was one of the leading intellectuals of the actual Marxist movement. Rosa Luxemburg was another mainstream Marxist, and there were others. And they were very critical. In fact, Trotsky was one up until 1917. They were all very critical of Leninism because of this, what they regarded as this opportunistic vanguardism. The idea that the radical intelligentsia were going to exploit popular movements to seize state power and then to use that state power to whip the population into the society that they chose. Now that was quite inconsistent with Marxism as understood by the mainstream sort of, I'd say, left Marxists. From this point of view, Bolshevism was a right-wing deviation. Trotsky made the same points up till 1917. Now, when Lenin came back to Russia in April 1917, he took a different line. Quite a different line from the one he'd had in the past. You take a look at Lenin's work, it shifted character in April 17. In April 1917, it became kind of libertarian. That's when he came out with the April Theses, and that's when he wrote State and Democracy. It came out a year later, but that's when it was written. And these were State and Revolution. These were basically libertarian works. They were very much more in the mainstream of sort of left libertarian socialism, from sort of this range that goes from anarchism over to left Marxism of the Pannekoek-Luxemburg variety. And he talked about Soviets and the need for a workers' organization and so on. In fact, came really closer to what the essence of socialism was always understood to be. After all, the core of socialism was understood to be workers' control over production. That was the core. That's where you begin with. Then you go on to other things. But the beginning is control by the workers over production. That's where it begins. Then Lenin took power in October 1917 in what's called a revolution, but in my view ought to be called a coup. And things followed that coup, or revolution if you want to call it that. One of the things that followed it was the immediate moves to destroy the Soviets and the factory councils. Those were some of the first moves of Lenin and Trotsky after they took, Trotsky joined at that point, after they took state power. In fact, if you look at what Lenin wrote after that period, or did, you'll find it's a reversion to the earlier position. This sort of left deviation is a deviation. You could ask why. In my view, it was just opportunistic. He knew that in order to gain power, he was going to have to go along with the popular currents that were developing, which were in fact spontaneous and libertarian and socialist, as most popular movements have been, in fact, since the 17th century. And being an astute politician, which he was, he sort of went along with that and talked the line that the people wanted to hear. It's just like when an American politician goes somewhere and his pollsters tell him, say so-and-so, and he says it, doesn't mean he believes it. And I think Lenin was doing the same thing without polls. In any event, whatever your interpretation is, when he took power, he reverted to the former vanguardism and moved at once to eliminate the organs of workers' control. Now that meant he was moving to destroy socialism, if socialism has as its core workers' control over production. The Soviets and the factory councils were instruments of workers' control. And same, you could say they're defective instruments and that had to be worked out better and so on, yeah, no doubt. But they were the instruments that had been developed in the course of popular struggle to implement basically workers' control, and those were the first things to go. By early 1918, it's still really before the Civil War set in, Lenin's view was pretty clearly expressed. It was the view that both he and Trotsky took the position that what you need is what Trotsky called a labor army, which is submissive to the control of a single leader. He said modern progress and development and socialism requires that the mass of the population subordinate themselves to a single leader in a disciplined workforce. Well, that has absolutely nothing to do with socialism. In fact, it's the exact opposite of it, and was criticized for that by in a spirit of some solidarity, because the revolutionary forces were still operative. He was criticized for that by people like Rosa Luxemburg and by Pannekoek and Gorter and the other mainstream sort of left Marxists, and I think they were right. It seems to me that, and then it just goes on from there. I mean, Lenin reconstructed the czarist systems of oppression often more efficiently, Cheka, KGB, and other techniques of control and oppression. I think from that point on, there was nothing remotely like socialism in the Soviet Union. I think it was, in fact, in my view, it was a precursor of later forms of totalitarianism. Now, you could, that's what I think happened, and I think that's what you discover if you look at the facts. Now, why is it called socialism? Well, I think I think that's complicated, and we should look at it. The Soviet Union calls it socialism, and after they took control they did take control pretty soon of most of the international socialist movement, because primarily of the prestige of having created something sort of socialism. Incidentally, just a side remark, Lenin remained, despite it all, a sort of an orthodox Marxist in many respects. And as an orthodox Marxist, he didn't believe that it was possible to have socialism in the Soviet Union. This was supposed to be up to his death, or shortly before his death, when he was still writing, speaking lucidly. He kept the view that the Soviet revolution was a holding action. They would just kind of hold things in place until the real revolution took place in Germany, because the revolution, according to Marxist doctrine, was going to take place in the most advanced sector of modern industrial capitalism, for all the reasons that you read about in Marx. That's where the revolution had to take place. Obviously, that wasn't the Soviet Union, so there couldn't be socialism there. It was just some kind of holding action. And that presumably gave some sort of justification for eliminating the socialist institutions. I don't think it's a real justification, but probably that was the internal justification. And again, in taking that view, he was in accord with the mainstream Marxist tradition. Well, after that comes the view that all of this is socialism. And why should the communist parties take that view? I think the reason is because they wanted to sort of exploit the moral force of socialism, which was quite real. It's kind of hard to remember that today, but at that time it was very real. This was regarded as a progressive moral force, and by associating their own destruction of socialism with the aura of socialism, they hoped to gain credit in the working classes and other progressive sectors. Now, the West also identified that with socialism, and they did it for the opposite reason. They wanted to associate socialism with the brutality of the Russian state that undermined socialism. So what you had is that the two major world propaganda agencies, for their own and quite different reasons, were claiming that this is socialism, that this destruction of socialism is socialism. And it's very hard to break out of the control of the world's two major propaganda agencies when they agree. They agreed for different reasons, but They basically agreed, and that then became doctrine and dogma. Well, I think people should ask whether that's true. Take a look back and see whether the moves that Lenin took and that Trotsky supported him in taking and that they both advocated had anything to do with socialism as it was understood by, say, in the Marxist tradition or in the left libertarian tradition. And I think the answer that you'll discover when you look at that is that they didn't. In fact, this was a destruction of socialist institutions. Well, you know, this may be true or it may be false, but if it's true, and I think the evidence pretty strongly supports it, then I don't see any reason why we shouldn't express that fact. And I certainly don't think that we should be deterred in expressing this fact if other people who's, you know, fascists or whatever, happen to condemn the Soviet Union, just for the same reasons that Trotsky mentioned in the 1930s.
So, to sum up, the idea of Chomsky's argument is that according to the true Marxian theory, the Soviet Union couldn't be socialist since it didn't satisfy the workers owning the means of production condition that defined socialism in the first place, according to the mainstream Marxists. So, the problems with the Soviet Union was almost several of them pointed out by Chomsky. The most important ones are the revolution being seized by the vanguard movement, the fact that the real socialist institutions such as the Soviets were dismantled, the revolution happening in a country that didn't have robust capitalist institutions as stipulated by Marxian theory. But this is not the end of our discussion. Socialism and Marxist theory isn't set on stone, as a research program is continued changing in dialectical fashion, so we introduce variations of the theory from a heterodox perspective, from what is known to be the Postmodern Marxism. I'll be adopting the perspective of the Armstead School of Professor Richard Wolff, Resnick and Wolff 1987. According to Burczak, Resnick and Wolff embrace both a postmodern epistemology that understands all human knowledge to be the product of unique, complex, and open-ended socialization, rather than as a mirror of nature, on the one hand, and on the other, a postmodern ontology that understands the constitution and causation of social events to be the overdetermined products of various, perhaps an infinite, natural and social forces. A central goal of Resnick and Wolff's configurations of Marxism is to prune the vestige of essentialism from Marxian thought. They reject the remnant of less instance economic determinism and evolutionary teleology in traditional Marxism. Since it is impossible for human knowledge to capture all possible lines of causation in social events, Resnick and Wolff reason that every social theory must inevitably specialize, adopting a favored conceptual entry point into social analysis and seeking to trace, albeit partially and provisionally, its causal connections to the rest of the social totality. The entry point for postmodern Marxism is the concept of class. Resnick and Wolff carefully define class as the process of producing, appropriation, and distributing surplus labor. The idea of class is distinct from other, more commonly held notions of class that focus on the distribution of income, wealth, and power, or the cultural habits of different groups of people. It also gives rise to somewhat non-traditional definitions of capitalism and socialism. Classical Marxism understands capitalism as a form of economy that combines widespread private property and more or less free markets to produce exploitation. Classical socialism then aims to abolish exploitation by replacing private property with social property and markets with central planning. For the postmodern Marxism, however, there is no one-to-one relationship between the presence or absence of private property, market and central planning, and the existence of exploitative class process. It asks, class process in which the producers of surplus labor do not participate in its appropriation. Class exploitation can persist in the presence of central planning and socialized property. So, the key element in this Marxist perspective is that to understand what real socialism is, we must understand what is exploitation. Resnick and Wolff define exploitation as the appropriation of the commodities created by surplus labor by those who did not participate in their production. The Soviet Union associated wrongly the end of exploitation with the end of private property. According to Burczak, in no way does eliminating private property in the means of production necessarily eliminate capitalist exploitation. Using their Resnick and Wolff's definition of exploitation to assess the Soviet experience, they conclude that inside Soviet state-owned enterprises, laborers still produce surplus values for capitalists, but now the latter were appointed state officials rather than private individuals, Resnick and Wolff 1994. A state-appointed board of directors, state capitalists appropriated and distributed the output created by productive laborers. Even though property rights in the means of production were ostensibly socialized, workers in the Soviet firms had no rights to appropriate the product of their necessary or surplus labor. Resnick and Wolff's interpretation of Soviet firms as an instance of state capitalism is consonant with Marx's assertion that during the capitalist labor process, workers do not own any of the products of their labor jointly creates, while capitalists are the last owners of workers' labor time. So, from a postmodern Marxist perspective, the Soviet Union wasn't real socialism because it didn't end exploitation, as real socialism is supposed to eliminate. Therefore, the Soviet Union wasn't socialism but an instance of state capitalism. So, for the orthodox Marxist perspective, it wasn't real socialism because of the vanguard movement, the end of socialist institutions, and the fact that the revolution didn't happen in a society with robust capitalist institutions. For the heterodox Marxist perspective, it wasn't real socialism because the Soviet Union didn't end exploitation, defined as the appropriation of the commodities created by surplus labor by those who did not participate in their production. The end. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.